While waiting. Masih waiting for meme seger nih di screen gue.
Oh, udah live ini Kak. Ada delay, ada latensinya gitu. Iya.
Oh, okay. Let me just refresh it just to check. Okay, good. Nah, it start sharing. Mungkin beberapa menit ya, beberapa detik ya.
Iya. Oke.
Ya, silakan dibuka dulu kalau gitu.
Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to the third session of Meme Seger Charity Clinic session. In here we have Rizqi Isnurhadi. We're going to talk about international trade and global supply chain. Yay. So everyone, this is the third session from the fourth session of the Meme Seger Charity Clinic session. Seminar for us to fund a charity to help our brother and sister that is facing a disaster in NTT. So if you find this seminar enjoyable and insightful, please do help us by giving by donating in the link in the description. You can click on the link on this description so that you can donate to them directly. You can also see the donation progress by clicking the link there as well. With that said, tomorrow we also have one last session with Kak Kushai. We're going to talk about how to defend non-liberal position for tomorrow. So please do stay tuned for tomorrow as well. With that said, let's start the presentation. Okay. Hi, Rizqi. You may start.
Hello. Okay. Yeah. I assume the screen is shared properly. Okay. So I'm just going to do an overview before we start to the topics. I'd start by introducing myself. My name is Rizqi. Rizqi Isnurhadi. I'm an alumni of Universitas Gadjah Mada in International Relations. I debated in the era of 2014 to 2017. Yeah, so I coached a lot of institutions after retiring. And I also retired from coaching last year. So you may not see me often in debate competitions. Yeah, but that's me. So in this presentation, what I'm going to talk about is I'm going to talk about political economy. In specific, I think we're going to talk about international trade and the global value chain or global supply chains, the more common terms. So I think let's start by, I wanted to show how impactful it is to our daily lives by showing you this picture. So this is a picture of a boba. Yeah, everyone knows boba, right? But I don't think everyone knows the complexity of creating this boba tea. So what's happening right now is in the US, there's a boba crisis. That means there's shortage of boba supply, that if you order one, you probably may not get the boba you want. So there's no boba in the market there. Why? Why is the shortage happening? The reason being actually lies on something that just happened a few continents away. That's the Suez Canal blockage. So I think most of you probably know what happened. Then it becomes a viral meme in Twitter. People are also talking about it. So there's a blockage in the Suez Canal. It is a canal that connects the Asia and Mediterranean Sea, and it got blocked because apparently one ship just got stuck in that canal. That creates a huge traffic jam for shippings, and that means shipping get delayed. Shipping from Asia to Europe and even the United States then is got just got delayed. So these these Suez Canal blockage um, caused the shipping of this tapioca starch that comes from Asian countries to be delayed. That means there's a few days of delay of uh, boba being distributed, being shipped to United States, and this caused this boba crisis. So I think when we talked about economy, a lot of debaters, or I think a lot of common people also think about it something very complex, something that's very detached to our daily life, and they thought like global supply chains is um, something that's out of the reach. It's not having any impact to the daily lives of people. But I think starting with this boba example, we show that we're very close to this global supply chain. Like we are really dependent on this international trade. That even a small barrier, which is just a ship getting blocked in a canal, could cause a shortage of a certain materials in a country so far away from the source of problem itself. So I think that gives you the relatability to what we're going to talk about. And yeah, I hope that people keeps being interested in the topic, even though most people think this is a bit more boring. So having started with that story, I think what I'm going to do next is going to explain more about the significance of these topics in debating motion. So how is it relevant? What kind of motion are we going to cover in the session? So as I think it is practically impossible to cover every kind of motion. I think the easiest way to perceive this session would be to introduce frameworks um, which could apply to a lot of debating motions. So I'm just going to go to the two types of motion example that we kind of get to answer in the session. The first type of motion would be this. So if you read on this motion, the motion reads, this has opposed the continued progress towards deep global economic integration. For example, very low tariff, removement of capital and labor across borders. So this is just one motion, but I think what this signifies is a motion where we talk about trends, where we talk about um, opposing or supporting a certain trend uh, in a global scale. So this kind of motion, I think, puts you in a third-party perspective on whether or not the increasing interdependence or integration in the global economy is good or not. Um, does it brings more harms than good, or probably it brings more benefit? So this is the first kind of motions that I think we talk a lot about in debating, which position ourselves as a spectators and just examine or judge whether this is a good thing or not. The second type of motion, however, I think would be more strategic standpoints. So the first one talks about like the trend in general and how does it impact countries, how does it impact us, how does it impact international relations in a way, from a very neutral third party standpoints. I think the second type of motion here, we'll talk a lot about more being in that shoes. So what would you do? What would a country do? So in this motion reads, this house believe that developing countries should pursue higher investment in refineries of raw materials instead of relying on exports of said materials. Yeah, that's basically the motion. So in this motion, it's more about how, as a country, um, how do you strategize in facing the global economy? So the standpoints that being different from the first type of motion is that you're talking in a first person perspective. You are thinking as a strategy what's good for the developing countries. So in terms of framework, I think there's a bit of differences between these two type of motions. In a sense, who are you defending? In the first type of motion, I think general society. I think you can talk about a more um, common themes such as the the development among countries, or you can take vulnerable actors in a sense that you may also talk about the developing countries, but you should relate it back to how this developing countries matter in that debate. Um, yeah, because basically the motion talks more about um, the general trends and how does it impact the world. The second type of motion, bit different. I think although the motion does not specifically state as this house as developing countries, but I think there's certain focus that you need to frame towards the developing countries, and it's more as a strategic. What's his best strategy to deal with that? So I think this is a two type of motion that I will cover in this presentation. So before going on to some of the theories that I like to cover, I think it's good to talk about how global value chains, that is global supply chain works, and how it being different from just like trading in general. Um, yeah, I think that's basically this what I want to cover in the types of, in the definition stages here. So definition, right? I think what I'm going to talk about here is more going to be, a bit of international trade, a bit of more global supply chains. We're going to more bit more focused towards the global supply chain. That's why I want to define it here. So in this global supply chain, it's more than just being countries trading with each other. So it's not just Malaysia giving us stuff and we give Malaysia stuff. I think it's more how the value chain is integrated across the world. That means that if a company that's based on US, they source stuff coming from Africa, for example, but then the stuff does not directly go to the US. That stuff got imported to China. What happens next? I think, that stuff from Africa, let's say we talk about steel or iron, they got transported into China, and from other countries, there's also other materials that comes in to China as well. So, for example, we talk about rubber that comes from Indonesia. So both stuff coming from different countries goes together in one place, and then they got assembled. That means the people in China then works on the assembly line. They create, for example, iron and rubber. They create the uh, pasimban, uh, automotive like vehicle stuffs. They created there, and then after they created there, at that point, then they export it to the actual market, which is, for example, European countries or um, the United States. So this is more than just countries trading with each other, but how the value chain is organized at different in different places, um, from sourcing, extraction, and then like building it, industrializing it, creating a value of it, and then distributing it to other countries in other markets. So this is a whole process that involves like multiple value creation. Um, yeah. So yeah, being marketed to all over the world. It's not just trading. It's more complex than that. I think that's try to explain how global supply chains actually is and how does it work, right? So yeah, having that cleared, I think we get the definitions cleared out. So when we talk about trade, it involves countries trading with each other, and then when we talk about global supply chain, it's beyond that. It's how the value chain is then organized. So I think that's covers the kind of definition. And then the next step, I think, after clearing up the definition, I'd like to talk about a bit about like the framework on theories about international trade and being involved in the global supply chain. So coming up to the development theories, I think very important when it comes to uh, the to debating the first I think both kind of motions that I just stated. So the first and second examples of motion, both debates will need these development theories in order for it to work well, right? Um, and yeah, I think this also puts your argument to a concrete framework rather than just like throwing an idea, but not necessarily having a overarching theories that uh, posit how it works together. So development theories and what it is. I think let's try to define first what I meant by these development theories. Development theories typically argues in how a certain path of a certain countries can develop their economies, basically the whole development. I think there's a multiple range of development theories, but I'll try to keep it concise with these three frameworks, right? These three core theories when it comes to development. The first one would be modernization, second one would be dependency, and third one would be post-developmentalism. So how do they differ from one another? I'll cover this one by one. The first one will be modernization. So modernization theories argued that globalization would bring and spread modernity across borders. So when a country is involved in globalizations, they will then modernize. Um, at the core of it, I think that's the main thesis that they try to pose it. But how, right? There's multiple ways in which modernization theories would argue how globalization spread modernity across borders. I think the first one they try to argue is that specialization, in a sense that if a country would be globalized and they trade with other countries, then it forces them to specialize in a certain way, and then they become more efficient in their production. So countries that is not good, for example, in producing crop, does not need to grow crop because they can import it from other countries, but they specialize in certain fields where they can develop the best products out of it. Let's say a countries like Wakanda. Yeah, let's just use hypothetical countries for this one. So let's say the fictional countries of Wakanda, they're not good at growing crops because their climate is not that good, right? It's not very suitable for you to grow crops in it. But they have another elements which are very needed in the world, which is like the vibranium thing. So if Wakanda does not trade with the globalized world, it means that this country will need to focus on a lot of stuff that they need to handle. At the end of the day, they are not focused, they're not efficient. A country that supposed to, like, for example, they could have industrialized their vibranium extraction, for example. They don't do that because they need to grow crops at the same time. It means that they cannot put special attention, more people, more resources into vibranium. It means, yeah, at the end of the day, they're not efficient. But if they go into globalized trade, they will become more efficient because they don't need to grow crops. They export from other countries. Their people can still eat while exporting and specializing in vibranium extraction, for example. So this is how they argue globalization will spread this modernity because countries become more efficient. They can get more stuff done. At the same time, they can still import what they don't have. So efficiency is the key here. But second one, I think another theory that modernizations can posit is that globalization is just important for you to um, gain the innovation needed, right? I think what they try to argue is actually if you don't globalize, if you don't integrate with the global economy, you will not get the necessary investment, both in expertise or capital, for you to uh, further develop your economy, further develop their to modernize, right? Yeah, taking back into the example of Wakanda, for example, right? They mine vibranium. Um, but because they don't go into globalization, it's less likely that they get firstly the capital to start mining the vibranium in the first place, but secondly also the expertise because yeah, they need to start from zero in mining technology. Whereas if they globalize, it means that they can export, they can import um, experts who have expertise in mining other things such as ore or steel or iron or gold, for example. So they could apply the similar principle into mining vibranium. And this makes the necessary push for that countries um, to modernize, right? If they don't, then they lack the initial capital, they lack the expertise. It takes uh, hundreds of years for them to figure out how to make use of their vibranium. So that's why modernization camp argues that globalization is the key to reaching modernity. If you don't have that, most probably your countries will not be efficient. Countries does not have the initial resources to modernize. So I think that yeah, that explains how development according to this modernization theories would look like. And this theory is actually very popular in the early stages. I think even up until the World War II, modernization camp was overwhelmingly supported. But then people figure out that this doesn't work, and some scholars started to argue about dependency theory. What is this dependency theory again, right? So, in regards to development, theories are used that globalization does not make everyone prosper. It just creates more inequality. It just creates apa yang kaya makin kaya, yang miskin makin miskin lah. To put it simply. So dependency theories they argued that if that the world is actually divided into core and periphery nations, which means that core countries are these wealthy states, let's say like European states or United States, whereas the periphery countries that are like the poor countries like Indonesia, for example, or like Latin America. So this dependency theory actually becomes a lot more popular in like the 1950s something when people finally found out like modernization does not happen. It's we have been globalizing for years, but that doesn't spread prosperity in these poor countries. How and why? Why did I view that? Right? I think yeah, most there's dependencies theories like started by Johann Galtung. They try to uh, they try to argue that when poor countries they trade with the wealthier countries, what happens is that the poor countries will just sell the resources from their countries, the extraction resources from their countries, and will sell it to the wealthier states. And the wealthier states will then process that and then export them back to the poor countries. This means that there's that flow of resources where the poor countries actually makes a lot less than the wealthy countries. How how does this happen, right? To put up a concrete example of this, let's use again the example of Wakanda, right? Yeah, I just really like to put this Wakanda example everywhere because it's more convenient. People know pop culture. So let's take a look at Wakanda. So if modernization theorists they argue that Wakanda will prosper if they go into the globalized world, dependency theorists argues otherwise. So if Wakanda, for example, they globalize, more likely than not, they will sell the raw vibranium to wealthier states. And oftentimes this is actually a very low price. Uh, People like the wealthier countries bought these resources at a very low price. Let's say they sell the vibranium for like $10 for 1 gram. Let's say like yeah, that's just a throwaway number. But let's take a look at it, that example and say Wakanda sold this vibranium $10 per gram. Who bought this, right? Most likely the wealthier countries like United States will buy it. They buy 10 grams of vibranium that only costs them like $100. So this, what happens then in the US? Most probably because they have technology, they have the initial capital. What happens is that United States is going to develop something out of this, right? They they created like for example they use the vibranium, they use it to make weapons. Let's say they make it, yeah, they make a shield out of it, right? They uh, process this 10 grams of vibranium and they make a shield. And because the people in Wakanda they need that shield, they buy it from United States for the shield for $500. Yeah, let's say they buy it for $500. So what happens is that Wakanda sold that vibranium for $100 and then buy it back for $500. So it means like there's a deficit of minus $400 there. $400 deficit on Wakanda. So this is what's going to happen, argue the dependency theorists, if globalizations were to happen. And yeah, if trade barriers were to be removed, um, this poor country will just get even poorer. The wealthier countries will just get richer. And it's not just the fictional countries of Wakanda. I think this happens in reality. It happens in the actual world that we live in. Let's say we talk about rubber, right? I- uh, yeah, people in my hometown they produce rubber, right? But what they do is that they only have this raw uh, rubber materials um, and extracted from rubber plantations, and this is not valuable at all. Like people actually, yeah, collect them, and the price is actually very low. But then once it's being created, like there's the value creation that's involved, it becomes expensive. Take an example, sandal Crocs, si sandal Crocs, bahasa Indonesia nya, bahasa Inggrisnya apa lagi? Croc slippers, so that costs a lot, right? Actually, when in actuality the materials needed to just produce that's actually very cheap. So this is what's happening in actuality, and it's not just the fictional of Wakanda, the fictional country of Wakanda that experience it. So this is what the dependency theory argues that will happen if globalization is to occur. So this is two contrasting viewpoints that we have here, and I think these frameworks are what you can, what you can bring up in a certain debates, and basically to form your arguments. And the kind of examples that I've just brought, I think this can also be useful. Um, Actually, I think I suggest you guys to bring real life example. Don't bring Wakanda in. Um, but yeah, I think that that's the gist of it. I think these two contrasting viewpoints will really be useful in certain debates. But I think as usual, when there's a certain debate, two contrasting viewpoints, there will always be the joy killer. Who's this joy killer? Yeah, the critical theorist. Critical theory typically they argue beyond that scope. They argue on a meta level. So in development theories, this happens as well. So when people are busy debating about whether globalization will bring modernizations or not, or it will bring dependency, then come the post-developmentalist that questions the idea of economic development altogether. They criticize that development is not the goal. Development is just an arbitrary goal that the world set up. Um, and yeah, they argue that we should not be looking into that anyway. Let's say like the modernization and dependency using the metric of GDP to measure a country's success. They use the GDP per capita, for example, a Gini coefficient to gauge on um, inequality, and then like post-developmentalists, the critical theories here will just be the joy killer and says like, no, you should not be debating about that. Yeah. So I think this is the third viewpoints that I just want to shed into light. Um, there are certain conditions where you can bring this up, but I think in majority of the debates that you will join, the motion will just revolves around modernizations and dependency. I think that's how debates are structured. Um, okay, so that's we covered a lot about development theories, right? So this tries to answer the motion that we just covered about this house opposing the continued global integration. However, I think I just want to raise a point here that not all debates are going to be black and white. I think in reality, most debates will not be uh, on the um, opposite end of the spectrum. So, in a way, I think if we talk about globalization's motion, it will not be full free trade versus full self-sufficiency. I think there is a nuance to that certain debates, and the debate typically happens on to what extent we should remove barriers, be it on a country to country level or on the aspect of it. Is it the trade barriers that we remove? What kind of trade barriers do we remove? Should we include free movement of labor in free trade agreements? I think that's the kind of debate that mostly going to happen. Uh, and in this session, I'd like to bring it on um, about selective trade agreements viewpoints, right? As mentioned earlier, I don't think there's a debate that will talk about whether, yeah, there will be, but I think it will not be as common. It will be less common for a debate to make it black and white, globalizations or protectionism. I think oftentimes it talks about nuances. For example, there's a debate about which I joined about um, whether developing countries should form a trade bloc between developing countries. So yeah, that's one of the thing. I think another one would be just like debate about ASEAN economic integrations, for example. So in this kind of debates, they're not like all out anti-globalizations or anti-protectionisms, but this debate argues on a granular level of it, on to what extent countries should trade. Is forming a trade bloc between developing countries good? Is it creating a trade bloc between ASEAN countries be good? I think that's kind of debate. I start with this regionalizations, right? Um, so yeah, I think this will inequality tries to cover the trade block. Um, yeah, even if like it's not necessarily ASEAN, it could be like Asian Development Bank, where China tries to create the RECP with a lot of developing nations. These are the kind of things that we talk about, right? About when I put this thing in the middle. So it's not necessarily just in the scope of an ASEAN. It could be RECP by China. So why then there's a debate about this, and why people are starting to form a thought about um, exclusive trade areas, or actually like exclusive trade partnership, including the RECP. RECP apa RCEP lupa. RCEP. Just quickly. Oh, RCEP deh, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. Yeah, okay lah. So yeah, ASEAN, RCEP, something. So the debate actually comes with the theory that globalization hurts only because it's influenced by colonialism in the past. So in a sense, what these people tries to propose is that if we enter globalization, we will get to the point of dependency. Why? Because we have a relatively different starting point, because we had been colonized before, and that's why the trade is not equal, right? Um, Contohnya, for example, like the detail of it adalah um, for Indonesia to trade with countries like United States or countries like Europe, probably we will not get any modernity, because we don't have similar capital, right? They already extracted it from us before, so to the point where we don't have any initial capital, and that's why we need their investment to bring us the capital, and that's why we are dependent to them. Or yeah, we don't have the initial capital to create a refinery, for example, and that's why we relied on them to create the refinery for us, and let them have the value, let them have the capital, let them enjoy the growth of the capital, um, because we are in a different starting points, and that's the reason why globalization does not work, and that's why dependency happens. So some of the camps argued this way. They try to contrast it uh, if globalization is to happen at a more protected level, be it from ASEAN regionalizations or RCEP, for example, they would argue that because of the similar starting points, there will not be a country that will lose from this, right? Um, they they argue that otherwise, if we um, create this similar starting points, then the level become competitive. We will not be dependent on the resources, because they also don't have the resources. So we're forced at the end of the day to downstream our production, for example, and compete in a more um, ideal scale. Uh, and thus, like, the winner will not necessarily be because of they have more capital, but because they are more efficient or they're more innovative in a way. So this is the core difference between like dependency theories and people who argue uh, about like regionalization theories. Is that if dependency theories, they argue that it's very structural, that it cannot be fixed, gitu ya. Regionalization, they say like there's a hope if we stop trading with these large countries, if we try to make the competitions a lot fairer, then actually international trade might work. So that's what they argue, and they also try to argue about this geographical proximity, cultural proximity, which means it's easier for us to trade with each other. If there's free movement of labor, there's a cultural proximity where people will just accept each other. We have the similar identity, for example. Right? So there's kind of this debate. So in a way, it's a debate between dependency theories and this regionalization theories. But I think the debate does not just stop there. I think from these charts, we can also talk about debates where both teams would agree to regionalization theories. But what they don't agree on is whether this specific trade deals consist of countries who have similar starting points and proximity. So, for example, it could be a debate about whether the RCEP is a good solution, right? So both sides of the debate, both government and opposition agrees that to a certain extent there needs to be a containment area. So there needs to be a exclusive free trade between um, different nations, not full scale globalization. There's an aspect both teams agrees on this. But I think maybe the debate wouldn't be about these theoretical frameworks, but how the members of that free trade fits into this criteria. Maybe if we're talking about the RCEP, um, we would argue that it's not going to be a good it's not going to be a good competition, and it does not prosper these uh, ASEAN countries because it includes South Korea and China, for example, right? Um, and at this point, the debate would just argue about whether Indonesia and South Korea has a similar starting points. Can we compete in a fair competitions if we join this partnership? Is it mutually beneficial for both countries? Is there any cultural proximity between Indonesia and South Korea and China, for example? So, yeah, in a way, I think there's also debate motions that will cover that kind of scenario. They don't specifically debate about whether we believe in full scale globalizations or we believe in full scale protectionism, but it debates whether there's a middle ground to it and whether this specific trade agreements consist of countries which can create that middle ground. Um, yeah, I think that's a bit about debating motions and how you can implement this um, theory lah, these frameworks. Ini udah aku bilangin tadi. And I think, yeah, before I move to the last stuff, mau ngambil minum dulu bentar.
Yeah. Okay, everyone. If you have any kind of question, feel free to use the Slido that we provide in the comment section in the live chat to ask question directly to Kak Rizqi. Kak Rizqi, you are muted.
Sorry. Ya. Okay. So ya udah minum tadi. Okay. The last thing I think I would like to touch on this session would be the reliability of globalizations and why I think it is tries to justify um, either two type of viewpoints lah. Either you full scale protectionism, tapi menurut gua I think it's also defending the selective partnership agreement juga sih in a way. So I think this tries to question again then how reliable is then the global supply chains. I think in the previous session, yeah, in the previous slides, I talked more about development theories, how we develop out of this in general, yeah, gitu, in talking about being open to trade in general and the scale of opening trade with other countries. But I think the last thing I would like to touch is touching a bit about global supply chain and why, how reliable it is, how, whether we should encourage it, whether we should participate in it, um, and whether like how you can also use this in a strategic motion gitu ya. So I try to highlight like three major problems of participating in this global supply chains, and yeah, how that actually is vulnerable to a lot of things. Um, and I think yeah, sebenarnya pengen cover satu lagi if possible, masih muat juga. I try to uh, cover like the morality of countries involving into this, and whether this practice would be good for development or not, uh, in a post-developmentalist perspective. Agak, but less priority. Let's jump straight into it. How reliable is it? How vulnerable it is, right? The first picture, I've given you an example of it, the boba crisis, how that impacts not only the buyers, the end consumers yang ada di US tadi, but also affects the overall global supply chains. Karena at the end of the day, like the tapioca starch may come from China, but the productions, the industry of actually creating the boba is not located in China. So at the end of the day, the customers also not in China. So having this large, having this long global supply chain and global value chains means that there's a lot of people impacted if one bottlenecks is caused. Right? In this case, kaya this evergreen blockage in Suez Canal, it impacts both sides of the global supply chain. The end customers does not get their boba. This penjual the sellers of it would actually receive an impact, because if the shipping is delayed, then let's say the another shipping could also be delayed, and it means that in there's a potential risk of them not being able to sell that fast, because people are not bringing it to the other side of the ocean. So ada yang basi misalnya. So that also create risk for the sellers, create risk for the buyers. So that's how unreliable and how dangerous it is. But I think that the other two pictures I explained here is like political unrest, and how is it not, how it becomes unreliable, because when you participate in this global supply chain, it means that you entrusted other countries to the faith of your business, to the faith of your economy. So let's say if we are in Indonesia and we export a lot of our raw materials to the factories that is in China or in Bangladesh, for example, that our our demand comes from them. We primarily sell it to them because we're involved in these chains. If a political unrest is to happen in these middle countries, and let's say like they're not stable, that means we cannot use this factory to create stuff. Yeah, our business is at a stake because of mistakes that we don't do, right? So, for example, misalnya businesses in the United States, if they don't involve in the global supply chain, don't involve in the global value chain, semuanya datang dari lokal, they are only susceptible to political unrest in their own countries, which they have a control of, right? They have the capacity lah untuk influence or try to lobby or try to make sure it's stable, basically. Make sure it's stable. It's possible because it's their base countries. Sometimes if their factories or their suppliers are located at some other part of the world, they don't have access to the political political decisions there, and there's a political unrest. They're a victim of something that they don't have a control of. And I think this also the same principle also applies for the pandemic. Um, a lot of countries depend on Indonesia, India for their supply, but they don't have control of how the pandemic handling in that specific countries are being taken care of, and that's possibly hurts their productions as well. So it means like this global supply chain might not have might not be the best strategy for companies or for countries to be participative of. Yeah, because there's a certain vulnerability to it. Um, yeah, I think that covers it about reliability. Just touching a little bit on whether it's moral or not. I think there's also debates about this. There's also debates about whether utilizing other countries for their global supply chain is actually immoral and whether you should do it. I think a motion that asks this moral question is the WUDC 2017, the Dutch World's Grand Final. It touches on this. It was about cari motionnya dulu. WUDC WUDC 2017 Grand Final. Sorry ya guys. Sorry Sam, ini sampai jam berapa sih? Sejam apa 2 jam?
Sebenarnya sejam sih, tapi it's okay for you to continue.
Oke.
Ya.
Ini gue takutnya nggak sempet nih. Ada sedikit motion. Okay. Yeah, this house would apply universal jurisdiction to crime against the environment. Okay. So this is the type of motion that questions the motive of companies and tries to govern the global supply chain. So the morality of participating in global supply chain is asked when there's a question about this. Why a lot of companies then participate in this global supply chain? Yeah, oftentimes because they try to outsource their production and they try to outsource the environmental impact that they're causing to other countries. Case in point, Tesla pengen bikin pabrik baterai di Indonesia. So they don't put it in the United States because it would bring in a lot of environmental damage. Then if they do it there, it's costly. I think, yeah, they possibly they wouldn't be able to make it anyway. Yeah, well, but even if they make it, it becomes very costly karena there's a lot of waste management issues to be handled and blah blah blah. Yeah, so it becomes a lot more expensive for them. So they instead it turns into Indonesia, which has more lenient regulation in regards to the environment. So what happens with the global supply chain? Why companies are doing this is also because they find it more convenient and more profitable if they just do this. Another like moral issues that pertains to global supply chain is also about labor protection, right? Or yeah, basically what you call as sweatshops in a lot of poorer countries. So oftentimes companies would just go to poorer countries. They use that countries to assemble stuff for them, not necessarily using it as a market. Yeah. Sometimes they just use it as the assembly line aja. For example, Bangladesh with its sweatshops in fast fashions. So they try to export what is not possible in their origin countries to these countries. So, for example, employing people in a very bad condition or very bad factories wouldn't be able to be done in their origin countries in Europe. So they outsource it to Bangladesh because it's cheaper to create that factory there. Does not have to have a lot of supervision anyway, right? In addition, they could talk about pay, which they pay the people in the Bangladesh lower than they would have to pay if they are to do it in the origin countries. So there's a lot of moral questions when it comes to global supply chains, beyond just like the core stuff about dependency, the core stuff about like the unfairness of international trade. There's also these practices that have highly questionable morals when we talk about global supply chain. Why companies does that, right? So what is some proposals that was brought upon to answer these questions, uh, to make sure that there's no vulnerabilities lah in this whole chains of system. There's no vulnerabilities. There's some proposal put in place gitu. One of them is like Dutch Wodeshi motion tadi. If you have a universal jurisdiction to crimes against environment, it means that countries, that companies couldn't choose countries where environmental law is loose, because yes, universal jurisdiction, semuanya sama gitu. So they cannot outsource this environmental damages. So that's one of the proposed solution gitu. So another one would be when we talk about apa namanya, treatment of labor gitu kan. It also like pertains the questions of having a universal minimum wage gitu. In a sense bukan kayak the value of $15 yang sama gitu around the world, but how do you calculate minimum wage, itu di standardized and uniform. In a sense, kebutuhan orang tuh seperti apa sih? I think that's the kind of minimum wage proposal yang masih being proposed and being thought of gitu. Karena people are not in line. I think if it's in Indonesia, for example, we don't take into account transportations as much gitu kan. We assume people walk to the office, like, by the way, dengan minimum wage yang kita punya sekarang gitu. And there are kind of like nutrition and food gitu ya. I think in Indo minimum wage-nya cuma dihitung dengan kayak ya udah makanan buat kenyang doang gitu. But in others more developed countries, minimum wage itu dihitung dengan kayak makanan yang bernutrisi, yang ada value gizinya gitu. So there are efforts to solve this morally questionable behavior by standardizing this, uniforming the standards. And if like minimum wage rise up in countries like Bangladesh, then this highly questionable stuff will probably go away. But then like, yeah, this brings up again the whole questions about whether integrating whether global supply chains will bring good or harms. If we are to do universal jurisdictions, if we are to do uniform standards of minimum wage, will investors go away? Will they just move away from these developing countries to an extent that they lack capital? I think that's kind of questions being asked. What's the alternative if these investors go away? If there's no H&M factories in Bangladesh, what would these people, what this worker would do? Would they lose their job? Will local alternative be sufficient in absorbing the workforce? There's a lot of questions pertaining to this. But I think what I try to raise here, I think I'm not raising like the actual arguments, but just trying to lay out some questions for you so you can research them more. And when certain debates about this comes up, you might want to bring up that arguments that answers that questions, and bring some example that answers that too. Generally that's what I can talk about. I think I covered like the definitions of the international trade versus global supply chain. I covered the development theory. I covered like selective trade versus globalization versus self-sufficiency, and I think I covered like global supply chains, its vulnerabilities, its morality, and what's proposed solution. Think mostly it from me. I'm sorry, I think I just can cover these basics. Uh, these topics are very broad. There could potentially be a huge lot of debates that covers the topics, which is not covered here. And as a caveat, I think this just be the initial spark for you to research more about that. I don't think 1 hour would be enough to cover everything. Um, and I haven't even go to payments. Like I was planning to go there because to a certain extent I want to talk about my work experience, but yeah, I haven't even go to payments as a trade barriers, for example. There's a lot of other questions that needs answered, and hopefully this will spark enough interest for you guys to try to answer that questions more. Um, okay, so I think for yeah, as we pass the 1 hour mark, I'm just going to try to answer the questions. Mau dibacain Sam atau gimana?
Okay, sure. Let's go to the first question. Yeah. Okay, so everyone is anonymous. Okay, first one. Do you have any reading regime to keep up with the IR related news?
Okay. Right. So reading regimes to keep up with IR related news. Okay, first of all, I think I gain a lot of these. I follow up to a lot of this news via Twitter. Jadi just make sure you follow the most updated ya, atau ya jangan most updated aja sih, sebenarnya the most quality one lah. You don't need updates, like you need the meat of it gitu. So one of them I would consider kayak the Diplomat, Mandala, uh, terus I think Financial Times to an extent bisa. Yeah, I think IR that covers it lah. For most of the stuff. Atau mungkin kalau misalnya mau cari-cari yang Asia tuh Nikkei ya, Nikkei to certain extent gives you a bit of insights. Yeah, I think sebenarnya ngikutin itu aja. In addition to that, jangan lupa coba dibuka Facebooknya, cari Satrio Pratama. Itu juga sumber berita yang cukup banyak. Okay, yeah, I think that's the answer.
Okay, we go to second question. Okay, does creating a single currency create a better economical integration in terms of international trade?
Okay. Creating a single currency create better economical integration. So that's like this is a whole motion, dan kayak menurut gue itu kayak satu debat BP sendiri gitu ya. 8 speeches to just talk about this. But the gist of it, I think the idea, if we have a single currency, yeah, it's easier karena we don't need to go past a lot of bureaucratic stuff when we're converting. Jadi kan sebenarnya permasalahan sama different currencies that it has different value, right? So Indonesia's ya misalnya ya $1 kan 14.000 gitu, give or take, 14.000. So and the problem with that when we trade these currencies terjadi not only in sebenarnya satu sih di payments ya, kayak how do you make a payment system that can transfer, or the payment infrastructures that can transfer that money in and out, and that's what we're working on, guys. Yeah, so that's where we're doing. So creating a single currency can help in a sense, no more conversion needed, and that's why EU tuh juga udah pakai itu kan, single currency kan, dengan euronya lah. So yeah, value, it cuts the barrier in converting the value. Okay, that's good in and of itself gitu kan. Tapi there's like a lot of challenges to it. If you have like single value, it means that there is no adjustment to that values. In a sense, ketika Indonesia, for example, have a lower value, lower mata uangnya lebih rendah gitu, it means we sell cheaper, we sell goods cheaper, right? We sell goods cheaper to other countries. And this is competitive advantage sebenarnya buat developing countries, karena if we have single single currency, then we wouldn't be able to sell as cheap as we are right now. So it reduces flexibility buat developing countries juga sebenarnya untuk trade dan mereduce competitive advantage-nya juga buat certain countries. So yeah, I think the core of the debate would just be about whether it's okay to sacrifice this country's flexibility in order for you to have in order for you to make trade easier or not. And also pertains the question juga di dalam EU, I think there's a crisis yang disebabkan oleh different fiscal policy. So although they have the same monetary union, they have the same currency, they don't have the same fiscal policy. Jadi spending dari negara A ke negara B itu kan tidak sama gitu. Misalnya polisinya Greece, dia lebih banyak mengeluarkan uang dibanding negara lain. Dan uang-uang itu goes to sektor-sektor yang non-produktif misalnya. Nah, and this also creates a challenge gitu ketika misalnya Greece mengeluarkan lebih banyak uang gitu ya, and their economies itu nggak suportif karena dia tidak memberikan uang itu ke sektor produktif tadi, dia memberikan uang ke sektor konsumtif. Value dari the whole EU currency, the whole euro currency drops karena kesalahan satu negara gitu. Nah, I think this can also this questions will also be asked ketika kita ngomongin creating a single currency. Karena ketika ke single currency terjadi and there's no controlled fiscal policy and there's no controlled philosophy on making fiscal decisions, possibly ada negara-negara yang ngasal, they spend a lot of money on consumptive sector, no productive push, negara yang jadi tidak produktif ya, value berkurang, dan yang jadi korbannya bukan cuma satu negara, tapi negara-negara lain karena udah ada single currency. So that could also be possibly the case, but that also then ask the questions about fiscal policy. If we are to create a single currency, will countries give up their sovereignty untuk membuat an independent fiscal policy? If not, then we're doomed. If yes, how do you enforce that? How do you make sure that countries can adhere to the same fiscal policy, or if not policy, philosophy lah paling nggak. How can you make sure that countries adhere to the same philosophy, especially when we talk about like different leanings in government. Ada negara-negara yang generally lebih leftist kayak Greece gitu, yang lebih demand more redistributions for consumptive purpose. Ini baru di level Uni Eropa gitu. We will move like towards the whole countries ya. You don't know what Zimbabwe is gonna do with the money. You don't know how for example Indonesia is going to use the money gitu. How they're going to treat currency, how they're going to make the fiscal policies. So there's a risk involved. In theory, it removes the initial barrier of conversion, of converting currency, of forex, foreign exchange. But there's a risk intact, and it's just a debate about how how worth it is to sacrifice these risks just for the sake of economic integration. Yeah, I think that's my answer to this question.
Okay, we go to the third question. Hi Kak, I don't really understand how a trade war works. Is it really just increasing tariff or is there more to it?
There's a lot. There's a lot more to it. I think that's. I think trade wars generally like you um, favoring certain countries to trade with, and like you don't want to trade that with that countries. Um, and scale kayak bisa ya gini juga ya, kejomplang juga ya. It could reach like from paling parah the most severe kan sanctions gitu. No trade at all. Sanctions in cut relations gitu ya. That's the most escalated form of a trade war, which you try to deplete supply in these countries to an extent they suffer. I think that's what the intention behind kayak Iran sanction, for example kan. Um, itu udah all out war. That's intentionnya udah bukan protecting our economy but like killing theirs gitu. So that's the most severe of it, like the most like very apa namanya paling paling mild gitu ya. Mungkin paling mild adalah increasing barriers gitu, increasing let's say we make it harder for them to um, export stuff here, be it from infrastructure wise, like mungkin selective partnership sama portnya gitu. Itu kayak mungkin political intentionsnya nggak politically charged ya, cuma kayak ya selektif aja. So like I think all of this can be defined as trade war, but what's like to what extent it goes really. I think I think if we talk like increasing tariff or increasing tariff, I think it's just the China and US trade war ya, kayak mereka emang mau retaliasi masing-masing gitu. Yeah, so for them it's probably just increasing tariff karena political charge-nya cuma to that extent. But like there's more to it. I think there's a whole spectrum of war that countries goes with, and yeah, there's too many of it. Makanya I think it's less likely that a debate motion would just quotes like support trade war, but I think that to a certain extent biasanya wordingnya akan lebih spesifik sih, kayak what specifically they're going to do. This house supports US increasing tariff in China gitu, or banning this house supports EU banning Indonesian palm oil exports. So these are all trade wars, but typically what we debate upon is like the specific policy within trade war supaya definition lebih jelas. Yeah, so basically there's more to it. Udah jawabin itu.
Yeah. Okay, thank you for that question and thank you for answering, Kak. Last question. Okay, I read about how the pandemic makes countries need to be independent with their own local trade. Should a country sacrifice their international economy?
So probably ini bertanya pada opini ya. Pandemic cuts the global supply chains, yes and no. Sebenarnya kayak in actuality, pandemic have very little impact to global value chain in general. It's less impact than we thought it would be. I think in the beginning of the pandemic, like people are questioning how trades would look like in the pandemic, how global supply chains would look like amidst the pandemic. But I think what we see after a year of the pandemic, the trade just continues. In a sense, bahwa we're still importing a lot of stuff. We're still exporting a lot of stuff. In fact, Indonesia's non-oil and fuel exports in this past 1 year during the pandemic increase year on year. Palm oil exports Indonesia to increase. Itu ya, pokoknya yang non oil and fuel ya, maksudnya gue ngomongin kategori seperti kayak palm oil gitu. Itu naik gitu dalam 1 tahun. I think reportsnya 2020 akhir ya, maksudnya year on year 2019 sama 2020 itu ada kenaikan 20% dari palm oil export dari Indonesia keluar. So what does this mean? This means like pandemic has very little impact, less than we imagine. But if there's like demands for countries to be more local gitu ya, let's say there's a demand for us to stop all these exports karena there's a possible infection during the trip gitu atau misalnya gimana, should we sacrifice the international economy? I don't think that in reality people will make decisions to sacrifice exports and imports. I think it's in reality like it's impossible to do so. To truly cut off. Gitu. Mungkin reduce, yes. Mungkin substitute a little bit, yes. Gitu ya. Mungkin increase production, local production, probably yes. But cutting off entirely, I don't think that's what most countries going to do. Because as mentioned di awal, sebenarnya kayak boba crisis itu jadi example yang segede itu gitu, kayak how countries are very very dependent on other countries for their supply. And like just a fun fact bahwa Indonesia still importing meats. Like we eat meat all the time. Bahkan salah satu signature dish kita kan rendang ya. But we import meat. So I think it's not possible for countries to cut off. Had Indonesia cut off, harga rendang bakal kayak harga emas kayaknya. So yeah, I don't think countries will sacrifice the international economy. But in the long run, let's say there's a restructurations of the international economy, and like let's say this pandemic takes a whole like 100 of years, and countries along that line can slowly increase local production and slowly diversify local production. Mungkin after 100 of years they start considering reducing trade with the international economy, but yeah, not now. I don't think it's unless it's a dystopian feature. I don't think they will do it.
Yeah. Okay, I think that's the last question. With that said, this session for this Meme Seger Charity session 3 for international trade and global supply chain is over. Thank you everyone for participating in this session. Don't forget that tomorrow we have the last session. We're going to have Kak Ahmad Usai talking about how to defend a non-liberal position. With that said, please don't forget to subscribe to our channel, to like follow up for tomorrow. Also, please don't forget to donate in the link that we have provided in the description. With that said, thank you everyone once again, and we'll see you tomorrow. Goodbye.
Bye.